My son handed me eviction papers at my wife's graveside. The ink was still fresh, the notary stamp still gleaming. Carol had been in the ground for less than 40 minutes when a man in a gray suit walked through the crowd, tapped me on the shoulder, and pressed a manila envelope into my hands. My son stood 20 feet away and watched. He did not look away. He did not look ashamed. He just watched, with Vanessa's hand resting in the crook of his arm, her dark sunglasses tilted just enough so I could see the small, satisfied curve of her lips. That was the moment I understood that what I thought was a family had been a transaction all along. And that night, when I finally got home to the empty house Carol and I had built together, I made a phone call. That call was the beginning of the end for both of them. My name is Thomas Hargrove. I am 67 years old, and what I am about to tell you is the most painful and the most clarifying thing that has ever happened to me in my life. Carol and I met on a Thursday afternoon in the spring of 1985, in the break room of the county assessor's office in Louisville, Kentucky. I was 28, working as a field engineer for a mid-sized construction firm that mostly did municipal contracts. She was 26, doing part-time bookkeeping for 3 different offices while saving money to finish her accounting degree. She was eating a peanut butter sandwich and reading a paperback novel she had hidden inside a manila folder so it would look like work. I told her I was impressed by the camouflage. She told me not to tell anyone. We were married 11 months later, in a small ceremony at her parents' Baptist church, with 60 people and a potluck reception in the fellowship hall. We did not have much. We had each other, and we had a plan. I had learned everything there was to know about HVAC and plumbing systems from the ground up, and I had spent years watching other men get rich off contracts I helped them win. Carol had a mind for numbers that was as precise and unsentimental as a blade. In the spring of 1990, we pooled everything we had, borrowed the rest from Carol's father, and opened Hargrove Mechanical Solutions out of a rented bay in a commercial garage on the east side of Louisville. I did the installations. Carol did the books, the billing, the payroll, the tax filings, and the supplier negotiations, all from a folding table in the corner of that garage, while our son Daniel, who had just turned 2, napped in a car seat next to her desk. Daniel was born in March of 1988, 2 years after we were married, when Carol was 29 and I was 31. He came into the world screaming and hungry and with more hair than either of us expected, and for a long time he was the best thing we had ever made together, better even than the business. Carol used to say he had my stubbornness and her good sense, and that the combination would either save him or ruin him. She was right about both. The business grew the way honest businesses grow, which is to say, slowly and sometimes painfully. There were years in the early 90s when we did not pay ourselves for months at a time. There were contracts that fell through and suppliers who shorted us and inspectors who made our lives unnecessarily difficult. But Carol never panicked. When I came home on the bad nights, tight in the jaw and too tired to eat, she would sit across from me at the kitchen table with 2 cups of coffee and a yellow legal pad, and we would work through the numbers together until something made sense. Problems are just puzzles with bad timing, she used to say. Every one of them has a solution if you stay calm enough to find it. By the time Daniel was in high school, we had 17 full-time employees and a reputation in 3 counties as the most reliable mechanical contractor in the region. By the time he graduated from the University of Kentucky in 2010, with a business degree, we had 42 employees, 3 service trucks of our own, and contracts with 2 hospital networks and the city school district. We had built something real, something that would last. I will be honest with you. We spoiled Daniel. I know that now in a way I did not let myself know then. He never wanted for anything. He drove a car we bought him at 16. He went to college without a loan. He took a spring break trip to Cancun at 20 that cost more than my first monthly payroll. I told myself it was because I had worked, so he would not have to struggle the way I had. Carol was more clear-eyed about it. She said more than once that we were confusing giving him things with teaching him the value of things. She was right. I did not listen carefully enough. He met Vanessa Caldwell in the fall of 2012 at a charity fundraiser he had attended as a representative of the company. The Caldwells were old Louisville money, the kind that had been old money so long they had forgotten it was ever new. Her father sat on 3 corporate boards and served on the board of trustees of 2 private schools. Her mother organized charity galas the way other women organize grocery lists, with precision and a careful awareness of who was watching. Vanessa herself was polished and intelligent, and about as warm as a marble countertop. She was also, I noticed from the very first family dinner, quietly contemptuous of everything Carol and I had built. She never said anything outright. She was too careful for that. But it was in the way she looked around our living room when she first came to the house, with an expression that was not quite disapproval but was certainly not admiration. It was in the small corrections she made when Daniel talked about the business, steering the conversation toward her father's portfolio and the venture capital circles she moved in. It was in the way she addressed Carol as Mrs. Hargrove, which sounds polite until you realize she said it the same way you might address a waitress. Carol noticed. She noticed everything. One night after Daniel and Vanessa had left following a tense Sunday dinner, she sat down next to me on the porch and said, "Thomas, that woman does not see us. She sees a problem to be managed." I told her she was being too hard on Vanessa, that maybe the girl was just nervous, that she would come around. Carol looked at me with those steady brown eyes she had and said, "I hope you are right, but I am telling you what I see." She was not being too hard on Vanessa. She was being exactly right. They married in the summer of 2014 inches, a wedding that the Caldwells largely planned and that Daniel largely deferred to, which told me everything I needed to know about the dynamic they were establishing. Carol cried during the ceremony, and I could feel the complicated weight of those tears, part joy, part something she was not ready to say out loud. During the reception, Daniel gave a toast in which he thanked his in-laws by name and his parents collectively as part of a list that also included his college roommate and his golf instructor. Carol smiled through it. She was good at that. The years that followed were a slow widening of distance. Daniel joined the company after the wedding, and he was smart enough to be useful and too impatient to be great. He wanted results without the relationships, profits without the grind. Vanessa filled his ear with talk about modernizing, scaling, bringing in outside investors, rebranding. Our clients had been with us for 15 and 20 years because they trusted us personally. Vanessa called that a liability. She said we were too dependent on the old-fashioned handshake economy. She was not wrong that the world was changing. She was wrong about what was worth keeping. Carol started having trouble with her handwriting in the fall of 2021. She joked about it at first, said her hands were going on strike after 30 years of bookkeeping. But by November, the tremors had reached her left hand as well, and the joke stopped being funny. In January of 2022, Dr. Patricia Winslow at the University of Louisville Medical Center sat across from us in a consultation room that smelled of antiseptic and fresh coffee and told us that Carol had Parkinson's disease, moderate progression, and that while it was manageable for now, the trajectory was something we needed to plan around. Carol took the news with the same composure she brought to every hard problem. She asked Dr. Winslow 3 specific questions, took notes on the yellow legal pad she had brought with her, thanked the doctor by name, and waited until we were in the parking garage before she let herself cry for exactly 3 minutes. Then she wiped her face, straightened her coat, and said, "Okay, let us figure out what we do next." That was Carol Hargrove. That was the woman I had been married to for 36 years. I called Daniel from the parking garage while Carol was still drying her eyes. He was on the other line and asked if he could call me back. When he did, 40 minutes later, he asked the right questions in the wrong tone. The tone of a man running a risk assessment rather than a son asking about his mother. He said he would come by that weekend. He did not come that weekend. He came 10 days later for 45 minutes, during which he spent 11 of them on his phone in the kitchen while Carol sat in the living room pretending not to notice. Over the next several months, Daniel's visits averaged once every 3 weeks, usually brief, usually with an exit already planned. Vanessa came twice, both times for holidays, both times with the energy of someone performing a chore they resented. Carol never complained about it to Daniel directly. She complained to me in the evenings, quietly, in the way long-married people communicate the deepest hurts, through understatement and careful silences. She said once, in the spring of 2022, "I wonder what we did wrong." I told her we had not done anything wrong. She looked at me and said, "Then why does he look at me like visiting me is something he has to survive?" By late summer, Carol had declined faster than anyone had anticipated. The tremors had spread, and her balance was compromised, and there were days when the fatigue was so complete she could not leave the bedroom. I hired a home nurse named Ruth, who was sturdy and matter-of-fact, and who Carol came to genuinely like. I canceled everything on my calendar. I told Mark, my operations manager, who had been with me for 22 years, to handle the day-to-day and call me only if something could not wait. I spent those last months sitting with Carol, reading to her when she wanted to be read to, watching old movies when she did not, making sure she was never alone in the hard hours before dawn when the body keeps its most private grief. Daniel did not come during the final 3 weeks. He sent a text message asking for updates. His wife, to my knowledge, did not contact us at all. Carol died on the morning of September 4th, 2022, in our bedroom, with the windows open because she had always loved the sound of the neighborhood waking up. Ruth was there. I was holding her hand. Her last words to me, barely above a whisper, were, "The box in the closet. Remember the box." I did not understand what she meant. Not yet. I called Daniel from the bedroom, with Carol's hand still in mine, still warm. He answered on the second ring. When I told him, there was a pause, and he said, "I am coming." He arrived 3 hours later with Vanessa, who was wearing a black blouse she appeared to have put on specifically for the occasion. Daniel hugged me briefly and went into the bedroom alone for a few minutes. When he came out, his eyes were dry. He said, "We should talk about the arrangements." The next 2 days moved in the way grief moves, through fog and logistics, and the strange bureaucracy of loss. I made the calls. I chose the casket and the flowers and the readings Carol had asked me to use, written in her looping handwriting on an index card she kept in her nightstand. Daniel and Vanessa were present for most of the planning meetings, but contributed mainly opinions about what kind of image we should project. Vanessa suggested the church Carol attended was not large enough for a woman of Carol's standing in the business community. I said Carol had worshipped at that church for 20 years, and it was exactly right. The funeral was on a Wednesday. The sanctuary was full. Carol had known more people than I had ever fully understood, had left fingerprints of quiet kindness across an entire city over 4 decades, and they all came. Colleagues, clients, neighbors, women from her book club, teenagers she had mentored through the vocational program at her church, the man who ran the laundromat 2 blocks from our first office, and who told me Carol used to bring them coffee on cold mornings when they were just starting out. I stood at the front of that sanctuary and felt the specific weight of a life well and generously lived. At the graveside, when it was over and people were beginning to move away, and the September air had gone from warm to cool, the man in the gray suit came through the thinning crowd. He called me by name. He asked if I was Thomas Hargrove. When I said I was, he handed me the envelope and said, "I am sorry for your loss." He walked away before I could form a response. Inside the envelope were papers notifying me that I was to vacate the family home, which I had owned and lived in for 24 years, within 30 days, on the grounds that the property had been transferred into an LLC, of which Daniel was the sole managing member. There was also a letter from an attorney I had never heard of, informing me that my role at Hargrove Mechanical Solutions had been administratively transitioned, and that my access to company accounts had been suspended pending a formal review. I looked up from those papers and found my son across the grass. He was watching me the way you watch something you have already decided about. Vanessa had her hand in the crook of his arm and her sunglasses on and her chin at the particular angle of a woman who has gotten what she came for. I stood there at my wife's grave holding a manila envelope while our friends and colleagues looked on in a silence that was worse than any sound I had ever heard. Carol's brother Frank reached me first. He was 10 years younger than Carol and had been like a younger brother to me for 30 years. He put his hand on my arm and said, "Thomas, what is that?" I could not answer him. My mouth would not form the words. Daniel approached with Vanessa close behind, and the attorney he had apparently retained for the occasion. He called himself Henderson, which struck me as darkly funny later, that men like this all seemed to have the same name. "Dad," he said, with a tone of practiced regret he had clearly rehearsed, "we should talk privately. I do not want to make a scene here." A scene. My son used those exact words to me at his mother's graveside. I want you to hold that in your mind for a moment, because I am going to tell you that I have spent a great deal of time since that day wondering if he understood how much he revealed about himself in that choice of words. A scene, as if the indignity were something I was creating, rather than something I was absorbing. I told him I had nothing to say to him there. I put the envelope in my coat pocket, and I stayed at Carol's grave until everyone had gone, until the funeral home staff were waiting at a respectful distance. Frank stayed with me. He did not say anything. He just stayed. That was one of the kindest things anyone has ever done for me. I drove home that evening to a house that felt like a stranger's house, like a stage set for someone else's life. Ruth, who had stayed to water Carol's plants, saw my face when I came through the door and made me sit down and put a cup of coffee in front of me without a word. I showed her the papers. She said, in her flat, practical way, "You need a lawyer first thing tomorrow morning." I already had one. His name was Raymond Kowalski, and I had trusted him with my business affairs for 27 years. But before I called Raymond, I remembered what Carol had said. The box in the closet. It was a gray, fireproof box on the top shelf of our bedroom closet, behind winter sweaters and an old photo album. I had seen it 100 times without knowing what was in it. Inside was an envelope addressed to me in Carol's handwriting, a USB drive taped to the inside of the lid, and a handwritten note that said, "Tommy, call Ray first, then read this." She had used my name, not Thomas, Tommy, the name she only used when something mattered the most. I called Raymond the following morning. He said he had been expecting to hear from me. He said those words in a way that told me Carol had already spoken to him, and that what she had asked him to do had been done. I asked him what was going on. He said, "Come to the office. Bring the box." I am going to tell you what I learned that morning in Raymond's office on the 14th floor of a building downtown with the Ohio River visible through the window, because I want you to understand how a woman who never went to law school outsmarted everyone who thought they had outmaneuvered her. Carol had been watching Daniel change for years. Long before I was willing to see it clearly, she had been building a quiet architecture of protection around everything we had built together. Starting in 2017, acting on Raymond's advice, she had restructured the true financial core of our assets through a series of holding companies and trusts that I nominally controlled, but that Daniel had never known existed. The 3 service trucks were registered to one entity. The real estate holdings, including the building that housed our main office, which we owned outright, were held in a separate trust. The operating accounts Daniel had access to were real, but they represented only a fraction of the actual value of the business. The rest, the accounts receivable streams, the real property, the investment portfolio, Carol had been quietly building for 15 years through Raymond, totaling somewhere in the range of $4 million, existed in structures so thoroughly separated from the daily operations that they were essentially invisible to anyone who had not been told they existed. And there was one more layer. Because Carol had anticipated that Daniel might try to pressure me through the house, she had transferred our personal home into a revocable living trust 18 months earlier with Raymond as the trustee. The LLC Daniel had served me papers about had no legal claim on it whatsoever. The papers in that envelope were, according to Raymond, either a bluff or a fraud, and either way, they were not going to hold up. I sat in Raymond's office and read Carol's letter. I am not going to share all of it with you because it was for me and it stays mine. But she said this, among other things. I tried to love him into being who we raised him to be. But some people choose differently, no matter how much you love them. Do not let his choices steal what we built. It belongs to the people who deserve it. You will know what to do. She was right. I did know. I want to tell you something about the weeks before I made my decisions, because I have seen the comments that people leave on stories like mine, and I understand the question behind them. Why would a man who ran a 40-employee business for 30 years sign documents without reading them, or calling his lawyer first. And I will tell you the truth, which is that grief does something to a person that is not about intelligence. It narrows the field of vision. You stop thinking in the long, straight lines of a businessman and start grasping at anything that feels like family, like continuity, like proof that the people you love still love you back. When Daniel called me 2 weeks after Carol's funeral and told me he wanted to reconcile, that Vanessa had been reflecting and wanted to try again, that they wanted me involved in the life of the grandchild they were expecting, I did not hear it with my business mind. I heard it with the part of me that had just buried the person who made everything make sense. I went to that meeting wanting to believe. I needed to believe. That is not stupidity. That is grief. Anyone who has lost someone they loved for 38 years will understand exactly what I mean. He met me at the office. The sign already said, Hargrove and Associates. My name in smaller letters than I had ever allowed it to be in my own life. He sat behind my old desk in the office I had built from the money I made laying pipe in other people's buildings, and he told me how sorry he was, how much the loss of his mother had clarified things for him, how he and Vanessa had talked about family and legacy, and the importance of keeping things together. He was good at it. I will give him that. He had Carol's intelligence applied to entirely different ends. The papers he put in front of me looked like a consolidation agreement. A simplification of structure, Henderson told me, so that we could operate more efficiently going forward as a family unit. I almost called Raymond. I had my phone in my hand, but Daniel said, Dad, we do not need lawyers between us. We are family. And I put the phone away. That is the sentence that cost me more than anything in my life. We do not need lawyers between us. I have gone over that moment 1,000 times since. The truth is that by the time he said it, I already wanted to sign because I wanted my son back. The papers were almost incidental. I signed. I drove home feeling something I had not felt since Carol's death, something that felt dangerously close to hope. I told Ruth about the reconciliation. I told Frank. I told myself that Carol would have wanted this, that she had always hoped Daniel would come back to himself, that maybe loss was the thing that finally broke through whatever wall Vanessa had helped him build. 3 days later, Daniel did not show up for the family dinner he had proposed. His phone went to voicemail. The next time I went to the office, the receptionist who had worked for me for 13 years looked at me with the expression of someone delivering news they wished they did not have to deliver. She said, Mr. Hargrove, Daniel left instructions that you need an appointment. The documents I had signed gave Daniel operational authority over the consolidated holding structure he had created, which he believed represented the totality of the company's assets. It represented the part he had always been able to see, which was the operating surface of the business. He had no idea about the rest of it. And the moment he locked me out, I called Raymond. Raymond was ready. He had been ready for this call since the day Carol first came to him in 2019 and asked him to help her build something her husband would need but hopefully never use. Within 72 hours of my call, the underlying real estate that housed all 3 of our office and warehouse locations was subject to lease agreements that required the operating companies to pay fair market rent retroactively from the date of transfer, with late fees that had already accumulated to a significant sum. The accounts receivable from the hospital and school district contracts, routed through the parent holding structure Carol had established, were temporarily suspended pending an audit. The equipment financing agreements on 7 units of specialized HVAC equipment that Daniel needed for 3 active contracts were paused, with all communication directed to Raymond's office. In 24 hours, Daniel went from believing he had taken over a thriving mechanical contracting company to discovering he was sitting on top of a structure with no financial floor. The operating accounts he controlled had enough in them to cover about 6 weeks of payroll. After that, without the revenue streams he did not know existed and with the real property suddenly demanding market rent he had not budgeted for, the math stopped working very quickly. His first call came on a Thursday afternoon. I did not answer. His second came that evening. I did not answer. His third came the following morning, and his voice on the voicemail was different from any voice I had heard from him in years. It had the specific quality of a man who has realized he is standing in water he cannot see the bottom of. "Dad, I need to talk to you. Something is wrong with the accounts. Please call me back." I let Raymond call him instead. I will not pretend there was no satisfaction in it. There was. I am human, and my son had served me eviction papers at his mother's grave, and I had held myself together through the worst months of my life, while he treated me like an administrative problem. The satisfaction was real. But it was not all that I felt. There was grief underneath it, the particular grief of watching someone you made become someone you do not recognize. That grief does not go away just because justice is happening. Within 4 months, without the underlying assets, and with 3 contracts running late due to equipment and financing issues, Daniel had burned through the operational reserves and was being pursued by suppliers he had promised payment timelines he could no longer keep. The employees who had been with us for years began to leave for more stable companies. Mark, my operations manager of 22 years, called me and asked if there was any way I was coming back. I told him I was not coming back, but I was going to make sure he landed well. I wrote him the best recommendation of his career and connected him with a competitor I trusted. Vanessa left when the house of cards fell below a certain height. It happened in the spring of 2023, about 7 months after the eviction papers. She had grown up in a world where money was a given, and she had made a calculation about Daniel that turned out to be based on incomplete information. When she understood the full picture, she made another calculation and left. She took their son, my grandson, who had been born in February, a boy Daniel had named James. I have never held James. I have seen photographs. He has Carol's forehead. That is the part that is hardest to write. Not the money, not the company, not even my son's choices. The hardest part is the small boy who will grow up calling someone else grandfather, and who will not know for a very long time, if ever, what his grandmother was like or what his grandfather built. I think about that on the bad nights. And then I think about what Carol said in her letter. What we built belongs to the people who deserve it. The Carol Hargrove Vocational Fund opened in the fall of 2023, administered through a partnership with 3 community colleges in Louisville and 2 in southern Indiana. The fund provides full tuition, tool stipends, and mentorship for young people pursuing trade certifications in HVAC, plumbing, electrical, and mechanical systems. Not because those are glamorous fields, because they are real fields. Fields that put food on tables and keep hospitals and schools and homes running. Fields that Carol believed in when she helped me build an entire life in them. The first cohort was 42 students. The selection criteria Carol and I had talked about in her final good months, before she lost the words for long conversations, were exactly what you would expect from a woman who grew up knowing the value of work. Financial need, demonstrated effort, a willingness to show up. The kind of criteria that do not care what neighborhood you came from or what your parents' names were, just what you were willing to do. At the opening ceremony, I stood at a podium in a community college gymnasium in front of 42 young people and their families and said something I had been thinking about since the day I stood at Carol's grave with an envelope in my hand. I said that the best revenge against people who try to reduce your life to a transaction is to prove that your life was never a transaction, that what you built was never just money, that it was people and time, and showing up every morning for 38 years next to the person who believed in you before anyone else did. I said Carol's name. I said it clearly, and I did not rush past it. She deserved to be named in the room where her legacy was beginning. I saw Daniel once more, about a year after everything fell apart. I was driving past a residential subdivision on the east side of the city, one of those neighborhoods of modest, newer houses that were going up fast. There was a work crew doing HVAC rough-in on a row of unfinished houses, and one of the men on the ground, carrying flex duct across a muddy lot, had Daniel's build and Daniel's walk. I slowed down enough to be sure. It was him. His hair was longer, his jacket was old. He moved differently than he had in the office, without the studied confidence of a man who believes he is the most important person in any room he enters. He moved like someone doing a job, which I suppose is what he was. I did not stop. I did not get out. I am not going to tell you I felt nothing, because I felt something large and difficult that I still do not have a clean name for. Part of it was sorrow. Part of it was a complicated, exhausted love that does not require a relationship to exist. Part of it was something that felt almost like gratitude, because watching him work honestly for the first time in years told me that somewhere inside the stranger he had become, there was still a thread of the man Carol and I had tried to raise. I drove home and I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, and I talked to Carol the way I still talk to her sometimes, out loud in the empty kitchen, in the plain voice of someone telling another person about their day. I told her I had seen Daniel. I told her he was working. I told her I thought she would want to know that. I kept the house. I kept Carol's plants. I kept her yellow legal pads on the shelf above the desk because I cannot bring myself to throw them away yet, and I am not sure I ever will. Ruth still comes by twice a week, not because I need a nurse anymore, but because we drink coffee, and she tells me about her grandchildren, and I tell her about the fund, and it is a kind of company that I am grateful for. The second cohort of the Carol Hargrove Vocational Fund enrolled in January of this year. 68 students. 3 of them are women, which Carol would have been especially glad about. She used to say the trades were 20 years behind on this, and someone needed to start moving the number. We are starting to move the number. I am 67 years old. I have 1 son I cannot reach, and 1 grandson I have never held, and $4 million worth of my wife's careful planning, working every day to give other people's children the kind of foundation we tried and failed to give. Our own. I do not tell you that looking for pity. I tell you that because I want you to understand what it means when I say that justice and peace are not the same thing. I found justice. The peace is slower. It comes in pieces, mostly at unexpected moments, in the faces of students at the fund's monthly check-ins, in the sound of Frank's voice on the phone every Sunday morning, in the particular quality of autumn light through the kitchen window that Carol always said was the best light in the house. She was right about that, too. She was right about almost everything. If you are watching this and you have a parent, you have been keeping at a distance. I want you to hear me when I say that distance compounds in ways you cannot predict. I am not speaking to you from anger. I am speaking to you from the other side of a loss that I would give everything I have left to reverse. And I cannot reverse any of it. Not one day of it. You still can. And if you are watching this because someone has done to you what my son did to me, I want you to know something that took me a long time to believe. Dignity is not something that can be taken from you at a graveside, or in a manila envelope, or across a desk in an office that used to be yours. It is something you carry. Carol knew that. She wrote it into the structure of everything she built to protect us. She built it out of 38 years of showing up and staying and choosing her people and keeping her word. Every brick of the Carol Hargrove Vocational Fund was paid for with what she protected. Every student in that program is proof that the people who try to make your life small are wrong about what your life was worth. And every morning I wake up in the house we chose together and drink coffee, and that autumn light is one more day they did not win. Tell me in the comments where you are watching from. I read every one. And if this story reached you somewhere real, share it with someone who might need to hear it. We publish a new story every week here on Frost Vengeance. Subscribe so you do not miss the next one, because the next one might be yours.